Hello, civilized people. Over the last week, a great deal has happened in the world. Mother Nature told California precisely what she thought of it by battering it with a number of storms. A certain former Fox News pundit interviewed some Russian guy who has been in the news a lot these last few years because of some kerfuffle in Ukraine and caused a veritable meltdown in the media. A $118 billion border bill, of which only 20 billion actually went to the border, failed to pass the House for some reason. But most importantly, and certainly most entertainingly, we have had 4 elections since our last episode, with voting taking place in South Carolina, Nevada, the American Virgin Islands, and Nevada again. In today's episode of the Goths and Rome podcast, we are going to be discussing these elections, a few current events that could dramatically impact both the ongoing primary elections, as well as those elections which happen to come up in November. So, Colton, how are you doing today?
Pretty all right, Robert. How about yourself?
I can't complain. What exactly is pretty all right?
Well, do you want me to go into it, or do you just like listing factors, or what's pretty all right? What do you want?
I've just never heard that term before. Pretty all right.
Well, it's all right. It's pretty all right. What do you want?
Right. So, the I suppose we're just going to jump straight into the elections.
Alrighty.
And the first one, which happened not the Saturday before we posted this, but the Saturday before that, is the primary in South Carolina for the Democrats. And who would have thunk it? Joe Biden won with better than 96% of the vote.
Good for him.
I know. Who would have possibly thought that the incumbent president would actually win a primary?
He needed this win.
He need honestly, we'll get to the reasons later, but he definitely needed a win. Unfortunately, this one came before some of the current tribulations. But you know, I don't think anybody's surprised that he won, and 96% is certainly a solid position to be in. I believe it was South Carolina that actually propelled him to the top of the pack in the Democratic primary in 2020.
You're right there.
And anyway, there is one thing that's sort of a takeaway, but it's not just from this election. We sort of have to compare it to 2022. And this year, the primary took place on a Saturday. This was a decision, presumably made behind closed doors, to try and increase the turnout as a way to try and drive enthusiasm. Because, if you show up and you vote for somebody in a primary, you're probably going to turn up and vote for them in the general election if they win. That's just a safe bet. But this year, it happened on a Saturday, and 131,000 people voted. Now, going back 2 years to 2022, that happened on a Tuesday. And even though it was on a Tuesday, 167,000 people voted, which that could be argued to be there's more enthusiasm, or it was viewed that more was at stake. And this ultimately equates to a 20% lower turnout. And now, Colton, we're going to go into the enthusiasm factor on this in just a minute, but I just want to sort of lay some things out for listeners.
Hmm.
Now, the 2022 and 2024 primaries in South Carolina, the 2022 was obviously not a presidential, it was an off year election. And those notoriously have low turnout. But the current primary in South Carolina was exclusively for the presidency, and you had an incumbent.
Hmm.
So those, in cases like that, those usually have a lower turnout as well, just because either people aren't following it, aren't interested, or if you've got an incumbent, it's pretty much inevitable. But so going into this a bit further, both of these primaries could be regarded, broadly speaking, as being rather useless in the eyes of the average South Carolina voter. Biden was going to win this. I don't think anybody ever questioned whether he would. I mean, he is in fact an incumbent, and that does come with certain advantages. Similarly, the headliner for the Democratic primary in 2022 was Joe Cunningham, who was a Democratic candidate for governor. And while not an incumbent, he was far and away the favorite, beating his primary opponent by more than 2-1. And honestly, it was hard to call that one an election so much as just a foregone conclusion.
Hmm.
Anyway, arguably, the primary headliner in 24 is more significant than the one in 22. Um, because, I mean, Biden can actually win the presidency. And I'm not saying this to be rude to any listeners who are affiliated with the DNC, but South Carolina really isn't your state. And I don't think anybody genuinely expected Joe Cunningham to win that election. So honestly, both of these could sort of be written off as not being that significant in the eyes of many. So, do you think that this could be a sign of campaign trouble, at least in the enthusiasm area, Colton? Because you've had two races, one in an off year, one in a presidential year, neither really having too terribly much at stake.
Hmm.
And yet, you know, I know Biden was having people go down and campaign on his behalf to try and drum up enthusiasm,
Yes.
but a 20% lower turnout, do you think that could be a sign of something to come?
Well, I'd like to look more into the numbers. I know you don't have these pulled up with what I'm about to say, but I think the most similar set of circumstances would be probably Obama, his 2022 or excuse me, his 2012 primary reelection season versus then the South Carolina governor primary in 2010, which would be the most similar to compare those two sets of data points. Um,
Yeah.
but
Unfortunately, I can give you some data on that.
oh, go
South
ahead.
Carolina only recently switched to a primary. Before that, you had a caucus, and those are generally not really comparable with turnout.
Yeah, yeah. Primaries are much, and we'll go into this with Nevada, especially. Primaries
Yeah.
are a lot more popular for people to go to. Caucuses are, and we touched on this in Iowa as well. Is caucuses are obviously very party oriented, and they're a lot longer of a process to vote in. So,
Yeah. It is a slightly different animal. Hon- Honestly, I appreciate the benefit of both. One is if you're looking for broad appeal, one is if you're trying to isolate what your party wants.
hmm.
And they both have a time and a place. But I do think that this could be I think I don't think this is a good example to point to it, but I think it makes looking into this further down the line once you get to some, deep blue states. I think once you get to that, whenever California, New York, New Jersey, any of those vote, Hawaii, I think that this is sort of pointing to something to look at later on. I don't think it's necessarily indicative.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason why I'm pointing this out is that enthusiasm gaps are kind of a problem. I mean, honestly, how enthusiastic your supporters are doesn't really win you an election. Nobody's going around grading enthusiasm, but that enthusiasm does come into play when you are converting someone from being an "I will vote for you" to them actually going and voting. If they're enthusiastic, they're more likely to go. and that's not an exact science by any means. But the reason why I think this is kind of a big factor is that Biden's campaign in 2020 was essentially him running on anti-Trump enthusiasm,
Mhm.
which that was a winning hand to play, a winning hand to play, because that was a very popular sentiment. But that was what he ran his campaign on, and right now, according to the numbers that I have seen, looking at averages from some of the better sources, Trump is polling about 7 points above Biden in popularity. So I think that's going to have to warrant a shift in campaign strategy if the Biden camp is actually going to make a dent in that. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if the "We're not Trump" hand is necessarily gonna win this round. Like, you know, for people that haven't been, I guess, glued to their TVs, looking at, you know, MSNBC, CNN, stuff like that, those people haven't heard much about Trump since he's been gone, except for the periods where he's been charged with things or he had a mugshot taken, right? And those kind of things appear to have Trump as more of an outsider to the political process. So that might even be appealing to some people and
Oh
make,
yeah,
yeah. So
we are in an environment like right now where people do not like political insiders.
yes,
Oh, we're definitely going to be talking about that in a bit, and sort of in some ways, I guess, assessing what that means. But that's not a topic for this topic, I guess.
this segment.
This segment. But yeah, back in 2020, the race was Biden's to lose. And in the same way that Obama was effectively able to run on the grounds, I'm not Bush, Biden has now been was able to run on I'm not Trump.
Hmm.
But where his popularity is now in the, I believe, high 30s, that's that's not a good place to be in. So next up, I think we're going to have to talk about the GOP caucus in the American Virgin Islands. Yes, the American territories, a lot of people aren't aware of this. The American territories do actually get a vote in the presidential primaries. Actually, on top of that, the Democrats have a primary for expatriates, um, people working as expats in other countries. So they sort of have their own vote as well. It's called Americans Abroad. It's actually a really interesting program if you ever want to look it up. But they just don't get to vote in the general election unless they're Washington, D.C. But looking at this, Trump won. I don't think anybody's surprised by that.
Hmm.
And but there was kind of a catch in the American Virgin Islands. Haley actually bothered to campaign there. She spent time on video calls trying to persuade voters, and she engaged in, electioneering activities as much as she could. I mean, this primary had, I think, under 200 people turn out for it. Excuse me. It's a caucus that votes like a primary because it's ranked choice. So it's technically a caucus, but it plays like a primary. Sort of an interesting thing there. But despite her making an effort and Trump not really bothering, Haley was crushed by a 3-1 margin, with Trump taking effectively 75% of the vote. So, what do you make of that, Colton?
Well, it, at some point, I guess she's gonna have to come to the realization that whenever she tries harder and she reaches out more to these voters, she seems to lose even harder.
Yeah,
And
that
go
I
ahead.
agree entirely. And like what we were just saying, the whole not the establishment thing, and I think this is relevant to this. Nikki Haley is really trying to push the fact that she is not the establishment. And, you know, there is a case that she can make that she really isn't anymore. Haley's ideology aligns with the neoconservative movement, and Trump embraces populist policies. They might have R's next to their name, but their policies are very different. Like their policies are almost as different as Democrats and Republicans. And to that end, I think for Haley's campaign, this is a case of the less Republicans know about Haley, the better she performs. Because Trump's entire rise to political dominance within the RNC was because of the mass hatred for the policies of the neoconservative movement. So while, I mean, it could be argued whether she is an insider or an outsider, she was definitely an insider of the party that Trump's rise was a repudiation of.
Hmm.
So I think you're right. I think her trying harder actually does her more harm than good because it seems like the more people know about her, the less they like her.
And there's also, I mean, that kind of does lead into Nevada a little bit, where she didn't try at all in Nevada, to be honest.
I can only imagine what would have happened if she had. But I mean, another thing that we see in this race also is that this is a race where only Republicans could vote, and 75% of them said no to Haley. And looking back at New Hampshire, she won what, 20% of Republicans?
Hmm.
Like 80% of her support was nonpartisan and Democrats. And actually, one of the things that I've seen since then that's been really humorous is the fact that in post vote polling of people that voted for Haley, something like one in third of them said they supported her running against Biden, but that in the general election they would vote for Biden.
It's just not tenable on a as a campaign. It's just proving to be not tenable for her.
Yeah. So next up, we've got actually, I guess, three races technically in Nevada. But the first one we're going to be discussing is the Nevada Democratic primary. Care to take a stab at who won that one, Colton?
I'm gonna say JB.
You would be quite correct in that. Joe Biden won with 89.4% of the vote. 5.6% went for the option none of these candidates, and 5% went to other candidates that were on the ballot. The largest of those being Marianne Williamson, who I believe has since dropped out of the race for whatever she was trying to accomplish.
Yeah, she has.
Yep. So we sort of have to come back to the enthusiasm thing here.
Hmm.
This is a state that Biden beat Trump in, Hillary beat Trump in. But right now, more than 1 in 10 people who voted in the Democratic primary, where he, which again, this was exclusively for president. These are people who are motivated enough to actually go out and vote for something like this. Nothing else was being voted on. This was a race for people who were motivated to go out and have a voice in something where the conclusion was, inevitable. And it was only that. But more than 1 in 10 people showed up to show their dissatisfaction with the current president.
Hmm.
Do you think there are any takeaways from this?
Well, I think it's more just a party unity issue rather than a Biden issue, at least in this, with it only being 10%. For example, one of the things that liberals are really unhappy with Biden about is his treatment of the whole Israel situation going on. Many more progressive people, and I'm saying more progressive lightly, but more progressive, view it as a they're supporting a genocide of Palestinians. The Biden administration is. So I think this is more of a party disunity thing, and they'll show up for Biden come a general election.
My my only question there is usually like voter those progressives are usually very very young people,
Hmm.
and and very very young people do not turn out for primaries, not in any meaningful number.
Yeah, I was just saying that as an example. That.
Yeah, I do think you are right in that regard. I think this is more a party disunity thing at the moment, just because of what's in the media,
Hmm.
which that may go up or down as we do have some quite a bit to talk about later on. But honestly, I'm going to look at this the same way I look at South Carolina. I believe that the issue here is something that we will have to look at whenever are actually results in from a deep blue state
Hmm.
somewhere that Lord, we're talking California, Oregon, Washington, in Illinois, um, Minnesota, somewhere that is just, you know, that state is going blue no matter who runs.
Exactly.
And I mean, in the case of Minnesota, I might be overstating that these days because that seems a lot closer. But still, I do think that it's an indicator of something to look for later on more than actually telling right now because it might just be like the first point in a pattern.
Hmm.
And I don't know yet. But oh boy. All right. So, folks, the next one we are going to talk about is the Nevada Republican primary. And I am not going to sugarcoat this. The Nevada Republican primary was arguably one of the most damning political rebukes to a candidate in the modern era. The Republican presidential primary in Nevada only happened because the state assembly, which has a Democratic supermajority, decided the RNC was going to have a state primary instead of a caucus, whether they liked it or not. The RNC, favoring a caucus, decided that they were going to have a caucus anyway, at their own expense, mind you, and the primary would be utterly meaningless. And essentially, a lot of states, there will be a fee to get onto a ballot if there's a caucus because they're run by the parties. And in the case of Nevada, it was, I think, $55,000. That's not expensive if you are a presidential candidate. And if it is expensive and you are a presidential candidate, you need to consider a new career path. But either way, there was a primary, and candidates on the Republican side could only be on the primary or the caucus ballot. The state party would not let you be on both. And as it so happened, of the two candidates that are still in the race, Donald Trump was on the caucus ballot, and Nikki Haley was the only name on the primary ticket other than two candidates who had dropped out before the first contest in Iowa. And there were, of course, a handful of relative political nobodies. For all practical purposes, Nikki Haley was the only name on the ballot, and she still lost, not just by a few points. As I mentioned before when discussing the outcome of the Democratic results, a fun tidbit about Nevada elections is that all state ballots for every category have a box for none of these candidates. Just so you know, you can vote, you can register your dissatisfaction, and that's that. None of these candidates crushed Nikki Haley by having 63.2% of the vote, whereas Haley only received 30.7, more than doubling the votes Haley received. And just to put this into perspective, in an election that in no way impacted anything related to the presidential contest, 48,736 people either showed up to vote or took the time to fill out a ballot and send it in by mail. A ballot which had no other races on it. And they did so not to have any effect on the presidential selection process. But they did so essentially just to tell Nikki Haley to go screw herself and that they want Donald Trump. Think that's a fair assessment, Colt?
Think you're completely right, but I think it's more appropriate to call, rather than this a primary, I think this is a referendum on Nikki Haley, and the people overwhelmingly voted no.
Yeah.
It
And one thing to note is that while Nevada is while the primary is closed, only Republicans or Democrats can vote. If you're a registered Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary. If you're a registered Republican, you can vote in the Republican primary. But you can change your party affiliation on the day of the primary in Nevada now. So you could have seen some crossover vote in that, and we don't have numbers for that, unfortunately. But in a race against literally nobody, Nikki Haley lost among Republicans.
and it's just it goes to show how deeply unpopular, she is among Republican active voters. That doesn't it's so far because this is definitely one of the cases where it's closed. It doesn't say anything about moderates, but it's not like that those numbers have been really, promising either.
No, it seems like Nikki Haley can only win amongst independents and Democrats, and a lot of those Democrats cross over to vote for her because they don't like Trump, and then they'll vote for Biden anyway. So I
Mhm.
have some very real questions on her about actual electability because Democrats aren't going to be enthusiastic to go vote for her.
Mhm.
And as it appears, Republicans sure as hell aren't enthusiastic about her. Yeah, I think that we might be looking at some very interesting polling errors in the unlikely eventuality that Haley becomes the Republican nominee.
Also, since, we had the pleasure of waiting a couple days now after this Nevada primary, we actually have some of Nikki's, responses to this primary if you want to go into that stuff, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, she's claimed that the Nevada primary system was rigged. Honestly, I personally think she's just kicking herself in the ass for not participating.
Mhm.
Because, she might have gotten a few delegates had she done so.
It's honestly I feel like it's almost like the nerve of accusing of accusing that a race is rigged against an opponent that you weren't even running against in this race.
Yeah. Um, Humorously, and for what it's worth, Trump did spend some time in Nevada because Nevada is a state. Trump's pretty much transitioned to the general election at this point. And honestly, I think that's a, perfectly reasonable thing for him to do given his current position. And Nevada is a purple state. So spending time there now, he's building those inroads, trying to drum up support for a general election. He's campaigning for November now. Nikki Haley didn't even bother. I don't think she spent any money in Nevada, but still, uh, I mean, I guess that the Nikki Haley campaign can now put out ads saying that nobody beats Nikki Haley.
Second to none.
Yep, second to none. And actually, believe it or not, this is not the first time that none of these candidates has won in a primary. It was 2014. The Democratic candidate for governor in Nevada got soundly drummed by none of these candidates in the primary. And if none of these candidates wins a race, technically the second place finisher is the winner. So, yeah, technically she did win, but if it's like with what happened before with the Democratic primary, they went on to get crushed in a general election.
Hmm.
So I think it's safe to say that Nevada is not, even if she is the candidate, Nikki Haley will not really contest Nevada.
And then just for, like posterity purposes, how many votes did Nikki Haley get in her primary versus Trump in his caucus?
We'll get to the caucus in just a second.
Okay.
And actually, we'll get to it right now, where they were on essentially different ballots in different races entirely, with Haley being in the primary and Trump being on the caucus. In the Republican caucus, Trump essentially ran unopposed. Um, you've heard us mention the guy Ryan Binkley before. He was actually on the presidential caucus in Nevada. Trump scored 99% of the vote. And for those of you wondering who Binkley is, he is a pastor from Texas. Um, and honestly, where that was a party run contest, you did not have none of these candidates on it. So among Republicans, in a race that is entirely Republican, Trump won 99% of it. And again, this is a caucus. This is a race where, you go in, you sit down in a gym, you listen to speeches from somebody speaking on behalf of the candidates, and then you vote. The votes are counted, and then everybody leaves. And so they generally turn out the most passionate and the most enthusiastic people, which caucuses were notably an area where Trump suffered in his original campaign in 2016. Cruz dominated the caucuses. But yeah, but of interest, and going to what you were saying, Colton, I've got some numbers here. I've merged essentially the primary and the caucus together. I have removed the none of these candidates option. And again, going back to it, it is harder to vote in a caucus than it is in a primary. A primary is easy, and there were mail in ballots. On the Republican side of things, well, obviously, Republican side of things, across all Republicans, the big winner by removing none of these candidates and just adding Trump and Binkley's numbers into the primary, Trump is the big winner with 59,545 votes and 68.2% of the total vote count. Haley got 22,637 votes with which is just under 26%. So by contrast, that's a fairly high performance. But I think if we account for the fact that caucuses generally have a much lower turnout, I think that would sort of shift to accommodate those numbers. Don't you?
Yeah, you really have to take into account the low barrier of entry of a primary election.
Yes. Uh, and for those interested, Mike Pence finished in third with 3.3% of the vote, followed by Tim Scott. Binkley, for all of his ambitions, got a whopping 536 votes. But if you round up, he's at 1%.
Is that a
So
generous roundup or pretty
he's at
close
point
roundup?
he's at 0.61. It's a very generous roundup. Um But let's see. Yeah, I honestly think that this is telling. I don't see a path for Nikki Haley. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Nikki Haley is dependent on college educated Republicans, which are a minority within the party, and she is dependent upon Democrats. And I don't want to slight that because in general elections, Trump is also dependent upon Democrats because I believe it was the autos worker union head endorsed Biden, but openly admitted that most of his people are probably going to vote for Trump. And these are, union Democrats, the sort of Reagan blue dog bloc.
Hmm.
Whereas Nikki Haley is trying to win with white suburban women and college educated Republicans. So I believe that sort of runs the whole cycle for the, well, covers all the elections that have happened since our last episode. But now there are a few things that sort of need to be covered that are likely going to have an impact on the rest of the race. The first one, it might not seem like all that big of a deal, but Ronna McDaniel has said she intends to depart as GOP chair following the South Carolina primary for Republicans. Uh, with the reason being, the general consensus from everybody except for Nikki Haley is that the primary will be over once Trump wins in Nikki's home state. Again, my apologies to Haley supporters for making that assumption. But if you can say that nobody has beaten your candidate in the same context she can, there really isn't much hope moving forward. So, what is your take on Ronna leaving?
I think for for anybody that works in campaigns, for anybody that supports local campaigns, and for anybody that follows their state's campaigns rather than the federal elections, this is massive news for Republicans.
Yes.
Ronna McDaniel has generally, uh, I mean, I'm just going to say it straight out, has been pretty incompetent. Um, her and what's the guy in Senate? He looks like a turtle. I forget
Oh,
his name.
Mitch McConnell. Mitch
Her and
McConnell.
Mitch McConnell have been known, they've been known to not support candidates that they do not personally like. They don't send money for local elections or for the local GOPs. They don't have any support. They don't give over voter data. It is reprehensible for a national chair to do this and to essentially
Yeah.
lose her own elections for personal vendettas.
Yeah. I'm going to throw Kevin McCarthy into that as well. Um, just so you know, I'm assuming most listeners aren't terribly familiar with the intricacies of this. But whenever you are Mitch McConnell as the Republican leader in the Senate, or what McCarthy was as the Republican leader in the House, both of those positions come with a lot of money that you can use because you have PACs, you have machines at your disposal that you can send out to go and attempt to win elections. And in the same way, and I'm not gonna pretend that Ronna McDaniel has that much sway. Certainly, I believe it was McCarthy usually had the most money. Presumably, he's out of that position now, so presumably that role was going to fall to someone else. But I believe that one of the what was it? 22 was probably the best example of this. Like, what was it? I'm going to cite Blake Masters in Arizona, and was it Laxalt in 22
Yes.
in Nevada?
It was.
Yeah, but both of these candidates were polling very, very close. And admittedly, in the political world, $1 million I mean, that's a lot of money, but it only goes so far. And both of these candidates polling fairly close to their opponents, but money was, instead of giving them additional funds were given to, and I don't remember the guy's name. He was a candidate in Colorado that was running a Republican campaign trying to appeal to Barney Bros. I think we both know that is a really dumb decision.
Yeah.
He was he was essentially trying to win an election as a Republican by saying, "Screw Republicans. I'm going to cater to the progressives." And they kept throwing money at him. When you actually had, what was it, Bulldog? What, the guy in Georgia in the runoff, the football player, McMa- Blake Masters, and Laxalt. I apologize to anybody who's listening who might be from South Carolina. I'm confused. I confused McMasters, who is the governor there, with Blake Masters out of Arizona. But Blake Masters is the one I'm referring to. I mean, these were very close races. And, if they had directed more money at them, there was a pretty solid chance that they could have accomplished some things there. But they didn't. And they threw it at races. Hell, they threw more money at the runoff race between two Republicans in Alaska for their preferred candidate instead of throwing it at a race where it was a Republican versus a Democrat. And that's unconscionable.
And also, just to point out that with those two races being in Nevada and in Arizona, it is quite a different Republican model of get out to vote effort spending there, because in these Southwest states where it's mostly desert, you have large population centers with very large suburbs, and it's sprawling. It's not like, say, a Tennessee or somewhere else in the East where there's lots of small towns that you have to work in. It is one large population center where your money goes a lot farther.
It does. I mean, I've had people go out and do door knocking for me before. And, doing it somewhere like Nevada, you can expect somebody to knock on, 10 to 15 doors an hour. However, if you're working in rural Texas, that might go to 3 to 5. Now, normally you don't engage in those same kind of operations there unless you are either really stupid, really rich, or both. But still, going now, going back to it, McDaniel did not have the same influence that McConnell and McCarthy had. But I just kind of want to go over some of these numbers to really, so people get a grasp of her misspending. Now, it's worth noting that the DNC and the RNC have different budgets. You're looking at the DNC probably having an additional 25, 26 million in their annual budget over the Republicans. And these are going to be, roughly, 125 million to 150 million. The DNC's payroll, like obviously these are comparable. The DNC payroll is, that's perfectly reasonable. The Republicans spend 15 million, the Democrats spend 20 million. Um, but there are some areas where, there are some questions. For example, um, as of the most recent budget I have in front of me, the Democrats spent $45,000 on office supplies. Meanwhile, under Ronna McDaniel, the Republicans spent $300,000 on office supplies. And these are offices. These are offices where people go in to work. These aren't huge staffs. These are small numbers. And during, election cycles where, that's when the majority of your own activity is going on, these people are going to be in an office. I mean, you can, like, if you've got people phone banking in a state party, they can work from home. But yeah, this is the I am dumbfounded. What exactly do you what do you get with $300,000 worth of office supplies, Colton?
Well, I'm gonna play a little bit of devil's advocate, right? But then I'm also gonna say something that makes it even worse for the numbers.
Okay.
So, devil's advocate, number one, Republicans are notoriously behind the technological advances in every sense of campaigning. It took them a while, a long while, to ever, transition to using electronic voter forms, to, using programs like Advantage, right, to track and do door knocking. It took them a
Yeah,
long time to catch up with that, and they
to do that
still
effective.
yeah, and they still might have people working in physical offices when a lot of the electioneering managerial jobs can be done from home. That might contribute to that, right?
The worth noting is that the RNC and DNC, I don't believe actually do those same types of electioneering activities. They might coordinate volunteers, but I
Mhm.
don't believe their money is actually going for that outside of like phone calls directly.
Yeah, and
So
then
yeah,
now I'm gonna say something that, depending on, your rebuke, Robert, it might make the numbers look a little bit worse for the Republicans too. And
yeah,
that's the fact that Donald Trump has been campaigning since 2016. He has not stopped campaigning. He has the America First PAC that, is separate from the GOP budget, right?
yes,
And they do a lot of their own funding for everything. They don't, because they know they're not going to get money, especially from Ron McDaniel.
yeah,
So even with that being separate and Donald Trump's candidates, the people that he endorses, and getting money from that and volunteers from that, the Republicans are still spending more to lose more.
yeah. Now, oh God, like I mean, if you think that one's bad, this is going to get a good bit worse before we're done talking about this. And I am sorry, but management consulting is, this is bringing in people that know how to manage a campaign, that know how to manage a pack, things of that nature. The people with experience in management consulting are the kinds of people that you want running a party. Full stop. You want people that know how to win elections, managing a political party. I hope that's not too much of a shocker to anybody. Now, sometimes, obviously, even a national party is going to have blind spots in its experience. And on the Democratic side, they spent $114,000 as of the year I have in front of me. I believe it's 2023 or 2022. I don't actually have that written down. I just copied it all in spreadsheets. But they spent $114,000 on management consulting. Meanwhile, the Republicans spent $1,078,000 on management consulting. That is inexcusable. That is entirely inexcusable.
That says a lot about their internal staffing problems.
Yes. I think in our first episode we talked about how, politics, at least within the parties themselves, is a wonderful career if you want to fail upwards. And this appears to be a telltale sign of that.
Hmm.
So yeah, that is utterly inexcusable. Like there is no defense for that. The next one I can't even believe that this is a topic. We're going to be talking about floral arrangements. Yes, if you are confused and you are listening, don't worry. We are just as confused. I mean, obviously, you're holding an event, you're going to, buy a bouquet of flowers for it. Maybe, decorate the office, make it look nice if you have guests.
Pull out vases on tables, all that nonsense.
Yeah. The DNC spent $795 on floral arrangements. The Republicans, meanwhile, spent $70,328 on floral arrangements. That is just under 100 times more. Colton, do you know of any rare exotic flowers that would warrant that?
No,
What, like, do they have like some kind of, I don't know, money laundering scheme with a local florist?
I'm just trying to think of, you know, what reasons did the Republicans run more events and they needed to like and then like higher scale events and they needed to decorate tables or
And I mean,
like have a
and I mean
wedding?
this, and again, this is the RNC. This is not a PAC. This, I mean, technically, they're, for those that want to get into the weeds, a political party and a PAC both have the same tax categorization as a 527, but they're governed differently, and uh, and they have different standards for reporting and whatnot. But seriously, what the absolute hell? Like that's another one that is just inexcusable. I mean, after seeing this one on this list, I'm surprised that like I didn't see, something for office makeup on the list for Rana. Just staggering. Next, actually, all right, here's one. Media booking consultants. The kind of people that, book people to appear and speak on behalf of candidates or speak on behalf of parties or help officials for a party, you know, they handle their schedule and, book their appointments. And for anyone who's worked in politics or in the entertainment industry, anything there are people that, make a career out of booking media appearances for their clients. If you are running a political party, you should know already well enough how to get yourself media appearances. The Democratic Party spent exactly $0 on media booking. The Republicans spent $116,000 on media booking. Now that's only roughly 1% of their income for this year. Excuse me, that's a negligible percent of their income, but that is a negligible percent of their income that could have been spent on other things if they seem to have a competent staff. That seem fair?
Yeah, that you should have someone in office doing that.
Like that should be in your payroll. If your payroll, if you are running a party and you don't have somebody there who is paid and salary and they are doing that professionally, then you are running a party incorrectly. Another one that just seems like really stupid expenses is limousine services. The Democrats spent $7,000 on this. The Republicans spent better than $250,000 on this. I mean, all these little expenses just add up. How? I mean, a limousine service is something that you can afford as a kid going to prom. That's a hell of a lot of limo trips at a more than $250,000, Colton.
Yeah. I
Can you can you see any excuse for that?
No, because Trump pays for his own things, right? So
Like, yeah, like, and these candidates typically have, they would cover it out of their own campaign expenses. What the hell is this being done for? Like, as best as I can figure, it's somebody just to drive McDaniels around. But now we're going to look at, I mean, these are gross over expenditures, but there are quite a few telling things that are just under expenditures. And like these are things that actually help candidates win. And the first one of these is voter file maintenance. I mean, honestly, Colton, I think it's fair to say that we've done a good bit in our career with voter file maintenance.
yep, and voter file building and upkeep and oh,
So much data.
mhm.
But looking at what we did and the cost of us doing it. First off, the Democrats, the DNC, not Democrats and all. Whenever I say Democrats or Republicans in this, I'm referring to the national parties. The DNC spends 200, let's call it $236,000 per year on this. Now that's not a huge portion of their budget, but still, that is a sizable chunk. That can hire people to go in and update files. It can have them, prepare data so that candidates can use it to win. Meanwhile, and this is honestly, I don't care which party makes this decision. This is just infuriating. The Republicans spent 39,000.
That's not even enough to staff one person on salary.
They spend 16% of what the DNC spends. That is utterly unacceptable.
That's letting your data rot. That's not maintaining it.
Yeah, and I mean, the Republican Party has long had a problem with data. I mean, Abbott almost lost, actually had his closest election 1 year because of his lack of data. The same could be said of most Republicans in Texas. But that's inexcusable. That is utterly inexcusable. And next up, we're just going to talk about state party transfers. And I'm just going to use this as a function of a percent of what the parties give because they have different budgets, but you would expect, something comparable. The DNC transfers about 15% of the money they take in to state parties. This is what enables them to do caucuses. It's what allows them to then transfer funds to smaller candidates to, you know, keep their own infrastructure up, to maintain their own data. And the DNC sends about 15%. Personally, I think that's a bit too little. But then we look at the Republicans and it's under 11%.
It's just not even competitive.
Like that's inexcusable. That is utterly inexcusable. The RNC is literally sending 60% of the amount of money that the DNC is to candidate to the state parties. That But strangely enough, it's not the most damning one. Electioneering activities. Now, national parties can only do so much. Um, you know, People get these, voicemail messages or text messages saying, "Oh, go vote," yada yada yada. And you would be surprised how many people that actually gets to go out and vote. It can also help with candidates Like if you've got a a jungle style primary like what you've got in California, and if people don't have a D or an R next to their name, the national party can send out a text message saying, "Hey, vote for this guy." If you're trying to generate name recognition for them, I mean, I've pulled the trigger on doing stuff like that before, and name recognition is basically what wins a lot of smaller races. And for electioneering, the DNC spends one point, let's round up to $1.7 million. The RNC spent 86,000, 5% of what the DNC spent.
Unacceptable.
Like I'm hoping this puts into perspective why a change of leadership at the RNC is likely a very beneficial thing to the Republican Party.
Well, on that note, then, should we move on to potential replacements of who's coming in?
Uh, I don't have right now. It's still up in the air, but the potential replacement, I don't remember their name, is the state party chair of the North Carolina Republican Party, and he's knee deep in party politics. But to his credit, he seems to be far more competent than McDaniel. As over the last few years, you've seen the Republican Party in North Carolina, at least, become strangely competent. Um, you've got a Democrat governor there right now, but sort of like Florida, you are seeing a situation where North Carolina is trending away from being a swing state to being a red state. And that would be something that, the state party chair can take credit for. And I know there's also talk of the South Carolina party chair going there as well into that position. Though personally, I think, again, I don't even remember their names, but just because of accomplishment, North Carolina would be a better choice because North Carolina seems to know what they're doing. And South Carolina hasn't really had anything that's, a difficult race in a while. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that they'd be a good choice. I think we talked about it a little bit on one of the other episodes where you can attribute Florida going from swing state to Republican to kind of the efforts of the governor there, right?
Yes. Honestly, if you've got a Republican governor, that governor is effectively the head of the state party. But you don't have a Republican governor in North Carolina. So the figurehead is the RNC chair. So I sort of doubt that Florida man
Mhm.
would want to give up his role as governor to become the RNC chair.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. Is that
Yeah.
the other success story of the modern Republican era is not available.
Honestly, Virginia has also become increasingly competent. Virginia is a state that, while still lean blue, could transition over the coming years to being, lean red, or to purple to lean red, given their effective leadership there. And some of that can be attributed to Youngkin, not all of it because that trend was starting beforehand. But still, there are options. But moving on to the next topic largely, and that's that, obviously Trump's criminal charges have been, something looming over the election. But there has been some news come out of Georgia this week. Actually, there's been two areas of his court trials where there has been some news. Um, his trials in Fulton County, Georgia, the attorney there, Fannie Willis, well, she's facing a lot of misconduct charges. Um, she has now admitted to having an affair with a prosecutor that she hired. And evidence indicates that she used state funds to bankroll, you know, vacations essentially for the two of them, funds which were meant for the case. Um, this has opened up a lot of questions about other things. And among the things that have come out, um, one of those is that there are now, well, she's an elected official. And one of the things that sort of come out from the investigation into her is in looking at FEC records of her donations, it looks like she's going to be accused of smurfing. Now, I'm I'm assuming most listeners aren't going to be familiar with fiduciary standards for candidates, but whenever somebody gives a donation to a campaign is required to ask for a name, an address, the type of work that they do, and there's a cap on how much they can donate. Smurfing is when people bypass that donation limit by just not providing that information. And that's information that you need to capture, if at all possible. You're not really allowed to have, you know, anonymous campaign donations because there is that cap. But still, that's something where I believe that, I mean, this was the case where I believe Trump was most likely to serve any kind of jail time. And it looks like that case is getting turned on its head. And honestly, I think this could actually help Trump come a general because Trump's been saying, witch hunt, the whole system's corrupt. And whenever people see stuff like this, I think that it could very well, make people inclined to agree with him on the statement. What do you think?
I generally agree with you, but I just want to ask on behalf of our viewers, does this have any direct relevance to the outcome of his case in Georgia?
It could be dismissed.
How likely do you think that that's going to happen?
Uh, Now, from what I've not been following it too heavily, but I understand that apparently this case received funds from the federal government, which means that the House can investigate it. The House is Republican controlled, so likely as not, I do think, given that funds were misspent, there is a high likelihood that it winds up getting thrown out
Interesting.
just because of House involvement. And do you have any other questions
Um,
on that one?
I don't really think so.
The next legal thing with Trump that has become was now entered the stage is for those of you who don't know, the state of Colorado claimed that Trump was no longer eligible to run for the presidency because he engaged in insurrection. And obviously, denying a presidential candidate ballot access pretty much immediately goes to the Supreme Court and it gets expedited. And it honestly looks like the Supreme Court is going to smack it down with a re. I want to start this off. There were two theories. I always sort of expected them to smack this down, but I had believed that it would be that either Trump must be convicted of an insurrection, which he has not been, or that the that Congress had to declare that something was an insurrection, which they have not, or that essentially an insurrection would be a crime against the federal government, meaning that only the federal government could make a declaration to remove him from ballots on the grounds of insurrection. However, the route that they seem to be going with, and I believe every single person there on the Supreme Court, the even the idea of the insurrection itself was largely ignored. And what it came down to would be who resolves the complaints if someone is removed from a ballot. Because as it stands, you've got a fairly low bar of entry for calling something an insurrection if a state can do it. And you're looking at a situation where, I don't know, Texas or, any red state could say, Joe Biden hasn't been enforcing border policies. This is an insurrection against the federal government. And then, remove him from the ballot for it. So obviously, in these kinds of cases, the Supreme Court would have to rule. The Supreme Court can't very well go around and rule on, 50 cases of somebody being removed from ballots. So it looks like that's the route that they intend to take of, in this case, it is not feasible for the Supreme Court to get involved in this. No method has been established for doing this, but, and then probably, some kind of causation of how to go about doing it that involves the federal government resolving it. That's that's my take, but it looks like they're going to shoot Colorado down. What are your thoughts, Colt?
Well, regarding what you were saying before, I don't even think in all of his cases against Trump, I don't even think he's been charged with insurrection in any of them.
He is not. From my understanding, there was an attempt to, but they actually lack sufficient evidence to charge him with insurrection because insurrection does have a very finely defined definition legally.
Mhm.
And like essentially, going back, I guess, to our last episode on the Civil War that's not going to take place. An insurrection is more along the lines of going to the National Guard armory, getting equipment, and then, seizing territory than it is to, a riot. But yeah, he's not been charged with it. Um, yeah, what is it? 91 criminal charges, four indictments, and not a one of them is insurrection.
Alright then. So shall we move on to the next topic?
Well, yes, and this one concerns both candidates, though not really the legal ramifications. Um, while Trump, both Trump and Biden have had issues with, you know, confidential documents um, being in their possession. In Trump's case, that will likely play out in court, if at all. Joe Biden's confidential documents case resulted in arguably a worst case scenario for the Biden campaign.
Not for Biden
That-
himself, but for his campaign.
yeah, they ultimately, yeah, and this is kind of shocking. The worst case scenario I'm speaking with are that the investigators found that A, Joe Biden had willfully shared confidential information, and B, Joe Biden lacked the memory and mental faculty necessary to stand trial. That's not the exact line, but it is the practical summary of what it contained. And that's, yeah.
Now, for
Uh,
a devil's advocate, as I often present during these podcasts, is that one, this was not a mental health professional or a doctor declaring this. This was the prosecutor on the case.
This was the special investigator, not the prosecutor.
Yeah, sorry about that. But
And
yes.
I'll also throw out, being a devil's advocate, that the investigator was a Republican. Believe it or not, you are hard pressed to find special investigators that aren't Republican. Although, to be fair, at this point, given the organizations that they work for, they generally don't like the Trump side either. So there's a case to be made for both sides about whether it's fair or not. Democrats can say, no, as a Republican, this is, you know, libel, what you wrote here.
Hmm.
And, you know, Republicans can say, oh, it's fair. The guy probably freaking hates us. I don't
Yeah,
know about, the guy's name was Her. I don't know enough about HUR, not HER. It would be very humorous to have a guy named Her, like HER. But yeah.
I was thinking like the German way, like HERR.
Oh,
Anyways, but
classy.
I think the more interesting part of this, outside of just that, decision by the investigator, was the press conference that he called afterwards.
Oh, God. You know,
And this is
all right.
Biden's press conference,
We're,
not
we're,
hers.
we're going to go back just a little bit. When we last discussed the presidential campaign, uh, we talked about how Biden was not inciting much confidence. He was not, and that Biden would need to go out there and prove that he could inspire confidence. And given the events of the last few days, I think it's safe to say that's not going to be happening. Following this release, Joe Biden held a press conference to counter the statement, particularly the assertion within it that he couldn't remember when his son Beau died. Um, and I'm going to give some credit here. Addressing something like this to a national audience is probably a bit difficult.
Hmm.
But Joe got up on stage, said, of course I can remember when Beau died. And then he said, he still carried the rosary his son had been given at Our Lady of, and then promptly forgot. The day honestly got no better for Joe Biden, and neither has any of the last time period. As well within the public eye, he confused Egypt and Mexico and insisted that the president of Mexico open the border to allow aid into Gaza. He is incorrectly cited speaking with three or four people at the recent G7 summit, all of whom were dead years beforehand. Actually, I believe all of them were dead before he ever, was elevated to the role of president. And Lord, he also said that he had spoken with the individual, I believe it was who developed the first insulin drug, and he died the year before Joe Biden was born. And he's in all of this within the public eye. Um, and what's troublesome is that, at least in saying that he's spoken with these people, is that he seems to do it again and again. And yeah, I think we're past the point of Joe Biden being able to, just from what we've seen, Joe Biden being able to inspire confidence by going out and speaking publicly.
Hmm.
Do you agree with that?
I do. And also, just to, so that we're nonpartisan here. There have been occasions where Trump has also missaid things like that. Like just
Oh,
recently,
yeah.
he um
Confused
confused,
Haley and Pelosi.
well, that, and also he said Viktor Orban is, a president of Turkey, when that's not true.
Yeah, that's Hungary, if I'm not mistaken.
It is. So there's
Well,
cases of
yeah.
that too. Obviously Americans are great at choosing who's going to be our next president.
Yes, truly.
But it seems that Joe Biden is just a lot further along.
Yeah. I mean, oh God. I mean, everybody has had their gaffes.
Mhm.
And Joe Biden is known for having a lot of gaffes. Like, that's part of his charm. But I mean, what was it? On the same day he said that he had secured 300 vaccines for COVID-19, talking about his record, then immediately tried to correct himself and then repeated the same damn thing. Like, I saw a list of it, and like on the same day, he had something like 15 or 20 gaffes within the public eye of like confusing things. And that doesn't really bode well. Although I do think there is one question to come from all of this, Colton, and we're going to have to, go into the paranormal a bit. But do you think that Joe Biden has developed an ability to speak with dead people?
Um, that'd be immensely helpful if he could, but
It would. Uh, I mean, if he can cite that, then you know what? He's going to have, he's going to have a very impressive campaign.
yeah, I mean, it would definitely, he's been this whole time he's been trying to, leak the fact that the paranormal is real, and that the State departments in his campaign are just trying to stop him.
Yep. They aren't aliens, they're ghosts. They're the souls of great great grandma coming to help us.
Joe
Oh
Biden's
God.
national seance.
The Department of the Supernatural.
That'd be cool. I love X Files.
I know, right? Speaking of which, we'll have to do an episode on aliens just because, we have to.
Hmm.
And, but yeah, I think the funniest theory I've seen in regards to that is that, Biden's getting old. At this point, he's probably got one foot in the grave, so he's able to talk to both sides, but not very well
On both sides, he's Sleepy Joe.
on both sides. But here's my next question, and this is going to be a hard one to answer. At this point, we have heard, given what we have heard, and given what we have seen, and given how often we have heard and seen it, do you believe that Biden has the mental faculty to A, run the nation, and B, be an effective candidate for the presidency?
Being an effective candidate, no, but I guess it already turns out that you do not have to, have the mental capacity to run it. It's just run by the council of the NC, his cabinet, and heads of departments.
Yeah, like that's, yeah, I'm, I mean, as a president, you can outsource a lot. You've got a full bureaucracy at your disposal. But it almost feels like, this is a time period where, and I hate saying this, but it almost feels like a situation where, for the good of a country, you follow protocol, remove him from office, and elevate just because it's necessary. And I don't say that lightly, and we'll get to that in a minute because I'm pretty confident either Joe Biden doesn't have confidence in Joe Biden or Joe Biden's people don't have confidence in Joe Biden. And to be a candidate, honestly, my standards for a candidate are low, really low. Um, just a funny story for all the listeners. Um, I once advised a campaign where the candidate put out an ad asking for political donations that came off more like he was asking for money for his daughter who had just gotten out of the hospital, and casually forgot to mention to his advisors that years ago he had beaten the shit out of a guy behind a Waffle House. So, if that can be a candidate, Joe Biden can be a candidate. Being an effective candidate, that's another matter. But he definitely has the capacity to be a candidate because standards are pretty low. So, here's my next question for you, Colton.
Hmm.
The press conference that followed was an absolute disaster. I don't think there's a way to spin that into a positive light. Do you think that there is any way that Biden's staff wouldn't know that this would be a total disaster?
Well, I think that maybe they're sticking with their formula of like pumping them with uppers, right?
Maybe.
And it's just not working anymore.
Yeah, like, and I mean, this sort of begs a follow up question. Because, I mean, if you're on a, if you're a staffer for a president, you were probably pretty heavily involved in the campaign, which means you know the game, you know how it's played, and admitted, and you're either really good or you failed upwards. And both, honestly, the latter is much more probable in both parties. Openly admit it. There's a reason why Colton and I do not typically work for parties. Uh, we like
Uh,
being surrounded by competent people. But here's my question. Do you believe that in allowing this to happen, his staff are ingenious and wanting him, like, they had to know that this was going to go poorly? Do you think that they were genius and that they wanted him to go out, look weak, so that they could, have the DNC could make a good case for swapping out Joe Biden later on, like what happened after LBJ withdrew? Or do you believe that they're going to be probably like 75, 80% of folks that work their way up on the party side of things and are just totally incompetent and said, screw it?
that's a tough decision. I genuinely, I'm sure there's some people like there are in any political apparatus and movement and idea that there are accelerationists, right? And the accelerationists would push like that or like not care about that result and go for something more, right?
Yes.
But I just it is so much more likely just for them to just be incompetent. And those people, being at the level of a presidential campaign, you're one of those people that has 30, 40 years campaign experience, right?
Yeah.
And if you've survived losing multiple campaigns or you just have one big win, and usually that's enough for some campaigns, one big win, you might be old enough that you just go, "Eh, he's all right."
Yeah, screw it. I do think that it is probably a case of incompetence. And honestly, the reason why I ask it is that there are some high level plays that political advisors will make. For example, we've seen candidates who, they are running for office, but they aren't running for office to win. Like this was a broad accusation of Trump when he ran in 2016. And they are running now to build some name recognition just to, you know, work toward advancement in a future election. Like they know they're not going to win this cycle. They're building up name recognition to possibly even run for something else in a future cycle.
Hmm.
And I mean, there are cases where, you know, it can be advantageous to sabotage yourself now for advantages in the future. So that's the reason I ask. Um, Anybody that thinks there are not a lot of underhanded games in politics doesn't know enough about politics. And this is one where I could see an underhanded game being at play. And the reason why I see it is that there has been a lot of talk about replacing Biden, possibly after the primary and at a convention at this point, because it's pretty much too late to get people onto those ballots. So somebody selected by, essentially selected by the DNC. But do you think that would be a viable ploy on their part? If this was a genius move, if this was a high level move, do you think that this is a gamble that could pay off?
Possibly. And for two reasons. One, just for the anti-Trump factor, right? Putting a new face on it might work, might extend the
Somebody with
lifetime of that plan.
somebody with better positives?
Yeah, not as many negatives at least. And
Yeah.
I think the other reason that it could be advantageous for them is that Trump's now had 4 years to make the playbook, and his team have had 4 years to make the playbook against Biden and have been collecting evidence and preparing statements, right? If you completely
Yeah.
change all that now, you send his entire campaign strategy into disarray.
Yep. It also depends on who you run him against.
Hmm.
Uh, Honestly, like a Harris would be the same animal.
Hmm.
The problem I see with it not being a genius play is that you would probably alienate, especially black women, which I don't really understand because Kamala Harris is Indian. Like, look at a picture of her parents, but everybody seems to think she's black, so we're going with it. You would probably see. Ah, Lord, I'm having a senior moment of my own. But I don't see the ability to easily swap out Biden for anybody but Harris and not alienate black women, which, if they piss them off, that's not a good place. And I cannot imagine Kamala taking it lying down if she was not the heir apparent. And I don't think making that switch is all that good, considering that nationwide, Kamala has a 28% approval rating, which is like 20 points below Trump.
Abysmal.
So I'm not sure that's a good choice either. I Yeah, that's why I'm reluctant to think it's a genius play, is because the outcome of that opens up a lot of problems. But it might be a case of, all right, we'll take an L to Trump now, but we'll put somebody in that can, run in 28 and challenge, maybe a Vivek, probably a DeSantis. Maybe a DeSantis at this point. I don't really know.
Well, that brings up the era of the America First movement past Trump. Once Trump's no longer eligible, like they might take this loss, like you said, and just be like, well, maybe it's a better roll of the dice to say that the Republican Party still doesn't have their stuff figured out in 28 when Trump can't run, when he can't unify the entire movement.
Yeah, that I think Trump has been taking steps with that, particularly with Vivek.
Hmm.
But yeah, I don't see that movement really ending. But still,
Maybe not ending, but not being as of a united front, like I said.
yes, I agree. Now, the other thing in reference to this that's kind of significant is that prior to the Super Bowl this year, Biden was offered an interview by CBS. I believe that was who was hosting it. It was the channel that was showing Super Bowl. Uh, it- Now, this is a 20 to 30-minute interview, and it was not Fox. So it was decidedly a friendly network for Biden and for Democrats in general. And yet he turned it down. Um, like this is an interview that would probably get more viewership than anything going because people are going to have their television set to that channel and they are going to see it. Now, he turned it down and instead he released a video online, kind of a throwaway thing about shrinkflation, which that's not exactly something you can throw out that wins elections. Like that seemed like an attempt to, appeal to the everyman, but I don't think that works. But he did turn down arguably the best opportunity he would get for free publicity that people would see in the middle of an election year. And I think, are you in agreement with me on this? That if you were basically any other candidate, that would be incredibly stupid to turn that
Yeah,
down?
I am. That's huge.
And going back to what I said before, that turning this down tells me either that Joe Biden doesn't have confidence in Joe Biden to inspire confidence, or Joe Biden's staff don't have confidence in Joe Biden to inspire confidence regarding his mental faculties. Like I don't see another light in which that can be seen. Like I like it's yeah, I'm at a loss. Do you have is there anything you can say that paints that in a positive light?
Not painting it in a positive light, but I don't know. I can just conjure
Or even
scenarios in my head of like why this happened, right? Like maybe, whoever books his appointments or answers, that stuff for him, maybe they just refused outright because they were just so embarrassed by the last conference. And it was just so soon afterwards.
yeah, but again, that would also be a case of his staff not believing he is competent enough to go
Yeah.
up and do an
I'm
interview.
saying like a single staff member like turned it down and like just
Yeah,
didn't bring it forward. But that's like the
I
only case I can see where it's not,
e-
scenario over.
well, let's put it like this: if it was a single staff member, that staff member would be fired
Oh yeah,
in a heartbeat. And yeah, I have to assume that this would go to somebody high level.
you'd think.
You're not going to have some grunt making calls about whether the president is going to do an interview or not.
No, yeah. I was just saying like some higher level person just took that and was just embarrassed and angry at him and just
Now,
sacrificed their job.
now the reason why I bring this up when we're talking about things that can impact election is: do you think Democratic voters are going to whether you want to define it as realize or believe that Biden might be a genuinely weak candidate? Um, do you think that even though he's running against a lot of literal who's, as you put it, Uh, do you think that some of those might start overperforming as voters are like, "Oh God, we can't run this guy"?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know. We'll have to wait, like you said, until we get to a more blue area. But
I think you're right, and also all it's worth noting all of these races that we discussed happened after this.
mhm. You mean happened before this?
Happened, yes, they happened before this news conference, or yeah, it's been a very busy few weeks. But anyway, to everybody who is still listening, thank you, and we hope to see you in our next episode, which should be returning to a normal schedule of a Wednesday release. And we hope to entertain all of you poor bastards then. So, with that, thank you very much for joining me, Colton,
Mhm.
and hope to see you all next week.
Have a good one, folks.